All right, good morning, everyone. I think we have a fair contingent of the people who accepted the invite. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, so we'll go ahead and get started. And if others want to join in as we go along, that will be great. For those of you, I think I've met and worked with most of you throughout the course of this process, but I'm Sean Shepard with the Planning Department. And I have with me today Molly Pike, also with Planning, and Bob Lehman with Planning, and then Councilmember Henderson is on with us this morning as well. I wanted to begin with just a few housekeeping reminders. I think everyone has participated in a WebEx meeting. We're all old pros at this point in the process, but please keep yourself muted unless you're the person speaking. That's going to improve the sound quality for everyone. And that is particularly true if you have joined the call by phone. I don't want to single anyone out, but there's one phone number in the list. Make sure you're using the mute button on your phone because if I mute you via the program, you may not be able to get yourself unmuted. But we'll ask everybody to use the mute button. If we're getting feedback, I may have to mute you. So if you think you're speaking and nobody's responding, check your mute button. Just given the number of folks in the call, we're going to use the virtual hand raise function if you want to be recognized. So you should see, depending on how you've joined, a small hand either down towards the bottom of your window or perhaps just to the right of your name if you hover over your name in the participants list. And you can press that if you want to virtually raise your hand. If you accidentally press it, you can click it again and it will lower your hand. We also have the chat open. I do want to give one kind of disclaimer about the chat. You are welcome to send a message there, particularly if you're having a technical problem or you're in an environment where you can't ask your question out loud. But I would really encourage you not to try to send detailed comments to us via the chat. We get that back in just like a text file. So it doesn't come with a lot of formatting. If you have a detailed question or comment, we welcome that, but please email it to staff if you're not able to ask it today. We do get a transcript of that chat, but it's not in a format that makes it easy to make sure we're understanding your feedback. So we'll use it as we need to today, but didn't want it to come across as the best place to submit comments. And then finally, we are recording this for future reference for those involved and so that we can make sure we're clear on your feedback. We have a lot to cover, so we're gonna kind of move quickly through a presentation, and then we want to make sure we have time for questions at the end. So we'll ask folks to hold your questions for that question and answer period if possible. And with that, we'll go ahead and jump in. So Molly, if you could click to the next slide. So a quick reminder, as I mentioned, most of you have been involved with this process throughout, but just a reminder of where we've been. The commission requested that staff take a look at the cluster lot option, which is a set of alternative zoning standards that are currently in the code and can be utilized by folks pursuing a subdivision proposal for new single or two family lots. And the commission asked staff to look at that section in early 2021, and staff evaluated how that section of the zoning code was being used in development currently. Over the course of last year, we worked with 3 different focused stakeholder groups, and those of you that are in this meeting today were participants in each of those. But as a reminder, we had a group of neighborhood leaders and residents. We had a group of folks involved in the development process and representing the development community, and then a group of folks representing different kinds of advocacy organizations. And we met with each of you, each of those groups a couple of times in the spring and summer of last year. We've also met with the Planning Commission for a couple of work sessions through this process to keep them up to date on what we were hearing from you. And for them to continue to give some direction to staff. And then we did actually have a draft out for public comment in the late summer of last year, and we've continued to kind of work and refine since that time, which brings us to today. And some things that we've kind of heard throughout this process, including pretty early on, was that the existing cluster lot option sometimes results in lots that are a little too different from the surrounding area. That sometimes the outcome of those developments that utilize the cluster lot option doesn't include enough open space, or the open space doesn't protect natural areas or the kind of features that folks might like to see protected. That there's too much flexibility in lot size without linking that meaningfully to open space. And then kind of a general point of consensus is that the existing standards are pretty confusing and unorganized and difficult to understand or use no matter what your perspective or goals. So we wanted to make sure we gave some attention to that too. But we heard a lot of feedback along the way in addition to those comments about things that folks would love to change in our zoning code or address differently. And I've used this cartoon in a couple of stakeholder meetings now because I feel like it's pretty easy when we start looking at amendments to the zoning code to turn into Miss Lucille Ball here. We get excited about the possibility of having things work better. And we've heard that folks want to revisit tree preservation, that folks want to revisit hill and slope development standards, the street standards that are required by our subdivision regulations or by NDOT, the lot requirements in our subdivision regulations. People had comments about stormwater, both process and regulations, recreational open space, a whole bunch of things. And initially we started taking all that in and we were shoving chocolates all over the place. And we took a step back and sort of realized that the cluster lot option is not ever going to accomplish everything that we might want. It's just one tool. And in fact, one of the things that is sort of challenging about it in the way it's currently configured is it's trying to do a few different things at once, and sometimes those work at odds with each other. So staff has really focused on trying to give this more of a mission statement and really focus in on, you know, what is it that we're trying to achieve here. And so for that, we came up with wanting to focus on conservation. And as I mentioned to several of you before, kind of the reason that that floated up as a good sort of primary purpose for this tool is that we've got sensitive environmental features or natural areas that contribute to our character as a city and as a county. And actually we heard from folks across all the stakeholder groups that those areas are pretty important. You know, we like having them in our neighborhoods. They provide environmental services, but they can also be nice amenities. We're, you know, sort of working with a tool that permits some flexibility of design, but that perhaps that flexibility of design would be more comfortable for folks if they felt that that open space that was included really protected sensitive features in a meaningful way. And so that's the direction that we've started to focus this tool in on. And so with that, we've really tried to remain sort of focused on that as the principle. As I said, there's a number of other issues that tend to get wrapped up in this, but we've really tried to stay with that kind of laser focus on the opportunity to create open space standards that are geared toward environmental protection and to really linking the flexibility of design to the quality and protection of that open space. And so with that, I'll transition over to Molly Pike, who's going to give you an overview of some of the refinements that have been made since last summer and the direction that staff would like to put forward to the commission for this tool to go. So.
Thank you, Sean. Good morning. So we're here today to talk about conservation development, and we're not going to call it cluster lot option anymore, but conservation development. We felt like it needed a new name. So I know you want to know, what is conservation development? And first, just a reminder that the existing cluster lot option is 1712-090 in the zoning code, and this will be replaced in its entirety with the proposed amendment of conservation development. So I'm sorry, I have to flip through my notes as we're doing this. So the purpose of the conservation development, as Sean mentioned, is to protect and preserve natural areas. So in general, we are proposing to define conservation or natural areas, and we're establishing the requirement for the preservation of these areas. Lot sizes will be the lot size flexibility will be directly linked to the conservation of natural areas, and we are defining natural areas and who manages, etc. So again, the focus is on natural areas. If we take a look at the existing cluster, we see that cluster lot is optional, is an optional standard. And if development utilizes this standard, 15% of the site is required to be designated as open space. And while natural areas are mentioned in this standard, they are not defined or required to be preserved. So if we move over then to conservation development, we see that we are proposing that it's going to be a required style of development if the site meets certain criteria. And one of those criteria is the existence of natural area. So what exactly is a natural area? As proposed in this amendment, natural areas are floodplain, streams, natural slopes of 20% greater or greater, problem soil areas, wetlands, habitat for rare or endangered species, cedar glades, archaeological or historical sites or cemeteries, and trees. So the purpose of the cluster, though, was the creation of open space. And that open space was accomplished by allowing a reduction in lot size. But with conservation, the purpose is again to preserve natural area. And in so doing, smaller lots can be created. But please remember that both of these standards only apply to residential districts, which are single family and two family residential districts, and that a site must be at least 10 times the size of the base zoning district lot. Conservation has an additional requirement that at least 10% of the site must contain natural area. The calculation of lot yield is basically the same, slightly different, but basically the same in cluster and the proposed conservation development. Now let's talk about open space and natural area. These have both been identified as the purpose for this section of the code. With cluster lot, created open space must be at least 15% of the parcel, and a recreation area is required. With the proposed amendment, the natural area open space is a sliding scale of area. A site must contain at least 10% natural area to qualify as conservation development. If more than 10, but less than 20% of the site is natural area, then the entire area will be required to be preserved. If more than 20% of the site is natural area, then at least 20% will be required to be preserved. This is the 10-20% open space referenced earlier on an earlier slide. With the conservation development, there's an opportunity to save more natural area. And remember, the minimum lot size will decrease as the amount of preservation increases. So even after the 20%, the greater the preservation, the greater the lot size reduction. The cluster lot currently requires a B or a C buffer, while the conservation development will require a C buffer in certain situations. So let's look at how this will work in the development of a parcel of land. In our example, we have an R10 one or two family residential district parcel. And in R10, the minimum lot size is 10,000 square feet. And in this example, we're going to make the assumption that 30% of the site is in natural area. Again, as defined or proposed to be defined in this amendment. With the current cluster lot option, as long as 15% of the site is in open space, you are able to reduce your lot size down 2 zoning districts. So in an R10 with the cluster lot, the minimum lot size can go down to 6,000 square feet. Disturbance of the natural area does not affect lot size, and no natural area preservation is required, which is why on this green lot, we see no natural area has been preserved. In the same example site, let's apply the conservation development. In the first scenario, remember we again have 30% of the site is natural area. And so since 30% of the site is natural area, we're required to preserve 20%, at least 20% of the site. So in so preserving that 20%, the new minimum lot size would be 8,000 square feet. In the next scenario, we're going to preserve 30% or the entire natural area and keep it undisturbed and place it in open space. So since 30% of the site is preserved, lot size may be reduced by 30% with the new minimum lot size of 7,000 square feet. So let's look at a rural example. In rural, we talk about primary conservation land instead of natural area. So here we have a site in T2 rural policy, which requires a rural character subdivision. In this example, the site is zoned RS20. With that zoning, the minimum lot size is 20,000 square feet. And again, in this example, we're going to make the assumption that the conservation land represents 36% of the site. All of the primary conservation land is required to be identified and placed in open space as required in the rural subdivision regulations. If we apply the current rural cluster lot option, we see that the new minimum lot size can go down to 10,000 square feet. Disturbance of the conservation land does not affect lot size. And all of the lots are required to be located in the development footprint consistent with the rural character regulations. So now we're looking at the same rural character site, same example site. And let's look at how a conservation development would apply in this situation. So here, again, the conservation area is 36%. If all of the conservation or primary conservation land is undisturbed, then lot size can be reduced 36%, and the new minimum lot size will be 12,800 square feet. Again, this is rural subdivision regulations, and as per those regulations, all of the lots are required to be located in the development footprint. In scenario B, with the rural character conservation development, we see that there is a stream crossing proposed. And so the undisturbed conservation land is actually 32% of the site. It's no longer 36%, but it's 32% of the site. So now we, of course, reduce the minimum lot size by 32% instead of the 36% previously shown. So what are the impacts of this proposed amendment? As we see the impacts of the amendment, there will be an increase in not only protection of land, but also in the preservation of natural area. There will still be the allowance for the reduction of lot size. but the minimum lot size, it will be directly linked to the amount of preservation of natural area. So let's go back and summarize. With the conservation development, the purpose is to preserve natural area. A site must have natural area as defined to qualify for this type of development. This section establishes a requirement for the preservation of these areas by not permitting disturbance in natural area. And of course, the lot size flexibility is directly linked to the conservation of natural areas. And it defines natural areas and who manages. As we move forward, staff is currently gathering public feedback on this draft, example with this meeting today. And we're finalizing the proposal for consideration at the Metro Planning Commission. If we receive your input within the next few weeks, it will be considered as staff finalizes this draft. Please remember that a proposal to change the zoning code requires a recommendation from the Metro Planning Commission, 3 readings at Metro Council, and approval by Metro Council on 3rd reading. The Planning Commission will hold a public hearing. Metro Council will also hold a public hearing on the 2nd reading. The dates for these public meetings have not been finalized. But remember that during the process, there will be several opportunities to have your say during public meetings at the Planning Commission and at the Council. And you can also, and we encourage you to do so, you can also send your thoughts and questions to staff through email. Please remember that if you believe that there are natural areas in this county that are worthy of protection, I urge you to come out in support of this amendment. Whatever you believe, if you want to have input, please take the opportunity to make your voices heard. Thank you. And Sean, back to you.
So we'll use this time if folks have questions about the current proposal that they'd like to pose of staff that might help inform your comments. You're welcome to pose those now. So if you want to raise your virtual hand, I'm happy to call on folks so we don't have everyone trying to speak at once. And I'm scrolling the list. And if you're having, oh, I feel like I saw one go up. Okay, I see a hand up from, I believe that's Jeff Hines. If you want to unmute and pose your question.
There was one slide early on in the presentation about the infrastructure, the current being 15% is deducted from the acreage. On one of those slides, it said 20% infrastructure now. I know Molly mentioned pretty much it's the same as far as calculating your gross density, but is that a change? Is that formula still applying?
Yes, Jeff, that is a change. The current standard is, if you want to calculate the maximum yield, then you remove 15% of the site and calculate that yield on 75% of the site. And what we are proposing is 20% of the site be used in that calculation.
Okay. And the only other one I was going to throw out there, and I'll share any other comments, is I saw where no stormwater improvements are allowed to be within the common area, or you lose credit, or the conservation area, I should say. Some of the stormwater improvements that are water quality oriented, just even preserving a grass buffer or something like that, seem appropriate to maybe mesh with the conservation policy. So just a thought, you know, that, yeah, if you're grading out a big stormwater detention basin, I would agree with that. But if you're preserving a cross flow buffer or something along those lines, you know, perhaps there's a way to allow for that, or even a little water quality basin, because you're planting that with native habitat, and seems appropriate to be something should be considered.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for mentioning that. We have hopefully put in some language. We'll go back and take a look at that, but we believe we have put in some language in the ordinance that would allow some of these natural areas, you know, that as you mentioned, that now currently would apply towards your stormwater requirements. We have looked at language to allow that, but as you are correct in stating that, you know, the large, you know, type detention basins that disturb a large area, those are the areas that we're trying to target because we do not want disturbance in a preserved natural area.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, the next hand that I saw go up, and I'm just taking these in the order that I see them, would be Dory with Harpeth Conservancy.
Well, hi, and actually Jeff was asking a lot of what I was thinking about already. So is there language that we can read too, so we can kind of get into the nitty gritty? Because you know, the devil's in the details. But I guess what I really wanted to raise was the stormwater design, that's retention ponds and all that. Is that allowed inside or outside of the natural areas? That's what I was trying to get clarification on. And Jeff's bringing up another good point, that some of those sort of best management practices actually are, you know, natural area type thing. So he and I actually were thinking about the exact same thing.
Yes, thank you, Dory, for asking about the exact language. We have prepared a draft, and we hope to have that posted to our webpage later today or tomorrow. We have been doing some last-minute edits on that draft, so we apologize for not being able to get that out to you all before this presentation, but we should have that to you shortly. And I know as you read through that draft, you may have additional questions.
Hey, thanks. And then also, obviously, these types of designs, is it basically kind of a net density or a gross density? So if I'm looking at 100 acres and 30% is in natural area based on the definition, am I looking at then however many lots based on the total gross acreage, or is it being subtracted, or the natural area being subtracted out to determine the number of lots that then get to be reduced in size?
No, that's what that 20% was. We're taking 20% off the top, and then that's what you're using to determine your maximum yield.
All right, so I'm seeing a couple questions in the chat about sharing the presentation or the video or the legislation. So I'll go ahead and answer those for everyone. Yes, we can send out this presentation to this group, and then we'll have the legislation available and posted to the website hopefully soon as well. The recording takes a little time to process from WebEx back to us, but we can try to share a link once we receive that. And so with those questions answered, the next person I saw with their hand up was Ruby Baker.
Hold on. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. Go right ahead.
Oh, okay. I was trying to unmute. Thank you for this presentation. I had a question. The old Bordeaux landfill, I'm not sure, but I'm thinking it was like, would that be considered like a natural area before the landfill was placed on it? And if so, my other question is, how can we as a neighborhood, or what can we suggest in type of zoning to protect it? Because right now it's considered a wildlife habitat. And I think it's only a few more years left on that from 25, 30 years before it could be developed on, I'm sure. But if it was a natural area before the landfill was placed on it, and it's now listed as a wildlife habitat, how can we as a neighborhood suggest the zoning to protect it? Does that apply here?
Hey, Ruby, I'll try to answer that. I'm not familiar with the details of that site specifically, although you could certainly reach out to us offline and we could take a look together.
Okay.
I'd clarify a couple things though. This tool is a set of standards that would apply when someone proposes to subdivide under the zoning that they have. So it would not be an opportunity to, it might alter the development pattern in terms of the lot sizes, depending on what's protected, but it doesn't change the zoning that applies to the property. If you or a neighborhood group were interested in changing zoning, that would be a conversation that you would need to have with the council member and also with the landowner, as generally the landowner needs to be the one who applies for a zone change. The other thing is that this tool is set up to recognize the conditions that are in place on a property when someone proposes to develop it. So if a site currently has natural slopes or trees or wildlife habitat as defined by this proposal, then this tool would apply. If it were previously disturbed under some other zoning allowances and those features no longer exist, then this tool may or may not come into play, but that would just be based on the specifics of the site. So I think you're welcome to reach out to us and we could take a look at that one together and try to give you some direction on questions you might want to raise if you speak with the landowner or with the council member.
Okay, I will do that because that's a discussion that we're having and we want some advisement and direction on that. Thank you.
Yeah, generally changing the zoning is a conversation that has to happen with the council member or the landowner, ideally both. But we're always happy to help landowners or applicants or neighborhood groups try to understand what the current regulations are and some kind of questions that could help advance those kind of conversations. So then the next hand I saw up was Sean Henry. Mr. Henry.
Hey, good morning, Sean Shepard, and everybody. Thanks for the presentation. Just my general comment is that the original cluster lot option that we have in our zoning code was just that it was an option for a developer to choose, and there were some incentives for doing so, you know, by being able to go down one or two minimum lot sizes and develop out a smaller area of a piece of property. And so there was sort of a built-in incentive to do so, but it was an option. My question is this now moving more toward a mandatory subdivision pattern, and where there is conservation policy in place? If there's conservation policy in place on a 100-acre property, is the development of that property, the subdivision of that property, now going to be required to use, you know, this new conservation subdivision pattern? And if so, then in having some incentives to justify that for the investment is going to be even more important than it has been up to date.
Really appreciate the question. We really in developing this tool, we're not looking at the conservation overlay. And so this tool of itself, we were looking at using the residential zoning districts without the overlay, conservation overlay consideration. And so yes, this is a as we are proposing it, this would be a required form of development, but only if a site has at least 10% natural area, as we have defined it. So if you have a site that only has a small amount of natural area, then this would not be your required form of development. But if you have a site with a larger amount of natural area, then yes, this would be the required form of development. Of course, you always have the option of maintaining that original minimum lot size. But with this tool, you can reduce that minimum lot size, as we discussed, depending upon how much natural area is being preserved. And, do remember that this is only one tool. If there are, is a large development that has a lot of natural area and that needs to do a few other things in looking at development, there is also always the rezoning to an SP, which would allow additional flexibility in how that site is developed. I don't know, Sean, do you have anything else to add to that?
No, probably just a clarification. I think there's sometimes some confusion about the conservation policy that other Sean Henry was referencing. So there is a policy, a land use policy that's applied across the county called conservation, and it is applied in areas where there is the potential for some of these features that are identified in this proposal to exist. So where we have information about floodplains or streams or slopes, you will sometimes see that conservation land use policy mapped. This is a little different in that this is not, and if you were to propose, let me back up a second. When we look at land use policy when someone proposes a rezoning. In this case, this would be a development proposed under zoning that is already in place. So we're not using the conservation policy as a basis for the decision. But this tool does define natural areas to include some of the features that are mapped as conservation policy. So I just mentioned that because sometimes that can be a little confusing. But I think there is some overlap, but this isn't an analysis against the land use policy because it's a tool to be utilized with subdivision, not with a zone change. So with that clarification, I think the next hand I saw go up was George Ewing.
Hey y'all, I was making sure I could figure out how to get myself unmuted. Thank you, everybody. My question follows a little bit on the other Sean's question. First, Sean, when you introduced this, you talked about how there was a little bit of conversation within staff about how originally folks were asking y'all to look at trees and slopes and stormwater and all those things, and then this ended up being pared back. So my kind of question hinges on if this is becoming mandatory for areas with qualification natural area to make it so, is there consideration that this would not be allowed or would be reduced from mandatory in T2 rural policy areas, because the rural subdivision guidelines take into consideration the perimeter lots, the setbacks, the view shed, screening, and that seems to all be gone in a mandatory conservation development option here. It's not an option anymore if it has natural area. And then I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, in my mind, this seems to present, I mean, you say that it's a tool and that some of those things were pared back so that it wouldn't handle too much or be asked to do too much, but yet it seems much more complicated and difficult to understand. And the buildable area calculation all of a sudden gives a lot size benefit to areas that are preserving primary conservation areas that were already protected in the rural subdivision guidelines. And the max lot yield calculation is taken from just a 20% reduction of the lot size as opposed to a net buildable area calculation. So my concern is that in disclaimers that this is just a tool and we don't want to take on too much, this seems like an enormously powerful tool to perversely incentivize a large parcel with very much challenging area that would yield a large lot yield, and then not have the protections for the neighbors or the area character with perimeter and setback and all that. So I guess I understand that this is coming in the ordinance wording, but these seems like really large unaddressed questions about this tool. So thank you.
Wonderful questions. I hope that we are addressing a lot of the things that you have brought up. I hope that we are addressing these in the current language of the amendment. We will definitely be considering this. If we have not addressed it currently, then we will go back and look at the language and look at the approach that we are taking. I guess one of the things that I do want to say though is remember that currently the cluster lot is permitted in the rural subdivision, rural character subdivisions. And so currently with the cluster lot, you're getting a very great lot size reduction. And so what we are proposing with the conservation development is that lot size reduction will actually not be as large unless an extremely large, 80 or 90% of the site is being preserved, then you're not going to see that large of a lot size reduction.
Right. Thank you, Molly. And you're right. And we all know that we have many areas of Davidson County where there's a large disparity between the underlying zoning and the policy over the area. So I guess that follows up then that this mandatory conservation development ordinance decouples from zoning. So where you had a tool of zoning for communities to say, let's rezone an area to something that impacts the previous cluster lot option because it was only 2 steps down in zoning size. That's not available in this new mandatory option, which is effectively a floor of RS 3.75 with conditions of how close you can get to that based on how much you're preserving. So let's say we had a bunch of Brick Church Lane neighbors that rezoned much of their property to RS 80. There was some protection in rural character under T2 policy in that the previous cluster lot option only allowed 2 steps down in zoning. The power of this tool decouples from your base zoning, largely based upon your your conservation areas. So thank you.
So George, let me rephrase that back to you and see if I can, it sounds like with regard to the rural subdivisions, right? I think our intent was not to overly impact how grouping or clustering or whatever we might call it of lots happens in rural subdivisions. The rural subdivision regulations already require that to some extent. And our intent was to have this updated version of clustering still function in that way. It sounds like your comment might be that at least when it comes to rural subdivisions, you would like to see the minimum lot size have a floor that is more in line with what the current cluster lot option permits. In other words, you would rather have no scenario where the lot size is reduced by more than 50%. Does that?
Thank you, Sean. And I'm only speaking for myself. I think that there are many hard-won protections in the rural subdivision guidelines as far as setback screening and view sheds, perimeters, and addressing character, that there was an opportunity here for this because it is so powerful as far as conservation areas and may end up being focused in those areas that becomes really important. Understand that the previous cluster lot option only had the 90% perimeter lots, but there's also, like say, an NS designation for zoning for STRs. There's not anything like that for community. And then the primary conservation areas that were protected by the rural subdivision guidelines now gets you bonus density all of a sudden, or bonus yield under the new one. And so I see how the tool, and those that were with me, I'm sorry I'm monopolizing, those that were with us in the stakeholder meetings that I were there know that I see the benefits of a tool like this, where you're increasing the area of preservation and you're shrinking the area of impact, but it's missing large protections that would make a difference, I think, in the implementation. And that's why we're here, is because the original cluster lot option was failing to deliver. So that's my comment. And thank you. Yes, Sean, you did hit on an important part. So I don't mean to just dismiss that. Thank you.
No, that's okay. I wanted to make sure I was interpreting your comments clearly, because I think that's something we can go back and look at with regard to the rural, the way this interfaces with the rural subdivision regulations specifically, because I think that's a narrower sort of band. Again, I think the proposal was intended to sort of link the lot size flexibility to the conservation area in a one-to-one way, but I certainly understand and hear that feedback. So we'll look at the rural sort of interface of that specifically. I did see a question in the chat was about whether this was incentivizing greater density than is otherwise allowed. I think we've had a lot of conversation about lot yield, and what I want to say to that is that this tool is functioning under the zoning that is already in place. This doesn't incentivize or offer any density more than the sort of maximum yield that someone could theoretically achieve under the zoning that's in place. So it's not a bonus tool. It just changes how the existing zoning on a property could potentially be utilized in the outline of the development. So the next sort of hand I saw go up was from John Stern.
Yes, thank you all for putting this together. I know it's been a long road. I really just wanted to add emphasis to what George Ewing is saying, that he's actually speaking for a number of us out here in the rapidly evolving communities in Davidson County. So thanks, George, and thank you all.
All right. I don't see any other questions or hands that we haven't gotten to. Again, as Molly mentioned, if you have, we'll get this morning's presentation and the language out, and we'll also be sharing that on our website so that folks who have not been engaged in our more focused stakeholder groups have the opportunity to comment. We just wanted to start with giving you guys a chance to hear a little more directly, but if you have other questions or comments as you're reviewing the material or giving it some thought, we welcome you sending those by email. Molly's address is there on the screen. And otherwise, as Molly mentioned, there will be kind of multiple opportunities to comment directly to the Planning Commission and Council as this moves through the process. We really appreciate kind of all the feedback and thoughts and time that this group in particular has devoted to engaging with us along this path over the last year. It's been helpful to have the input from so many different perspectives. And we look forward to any comments that you might send us and to getting this finalized so we can get it through the legislative process. So thanks for being here, everybody. Appreciate the time.